You're listening to the beautiful sounds of asteroids, canyon bomber, air-sea battle, missile command, and Pong. These are just a few of the very first video games designed by the brilliant minds at Atari. I played these games so much while growing up that when I closed my eyes at night, I could still see the black and white triangular ship blowing up asteroids because it was burned into my retinas. And I was far from alone. Millions fell in love with Atari and, like me, poured every quarter of our allowance into arcade games and cartridges. However, behind their incredible success was a small group of leaders grappling with the paralyzing fear of losing control, and it would become Atari's greatest enemy to its survival. Hi everyone, I'm Terrace Wayner, and welcome to another episode of A Case Study in Corporate Fear, where I do the forensics to better understand how and why fear transforms brave leaders of thriving companies into spineless failures of corporate catastrophes. Also, you never do. And while most know the names of epic fails like Kodak, Tower Records, Blockbuster, and BlackBerry, what most don't know is that the true mastermind behind their collapse was fear. In today's case study, I analyze Atari, the company that pioneered today's $300 billion gaming industry. It was a company that went from a $250 startup to controlling 80% of the video game market. A company that should be sitting next to Nintendo, PlayStation, and Xbox. Instead, they became the poster child for how not to manage talent. But before we unpack the fall, we need to spend some time on just how revolutionary Atari was before they ran out of lives and game over flickered up on the screen. To do that, we need to go back to 1972 to a converted roller rink in Sunnyvale, California, where two guys are inventing the future of entertainment with spare parts and pure audacity. Their names were Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney, and they had a big idea. What if instead of just watching games on a television screen, you could actually play them? They called their idea Atari, after a term in the board game, Go. It means your opponent's stones are in danger, essentially equivalent to saying check in chess. Bushnell was obsessed with Go as well as other games and was a true believer in fun. He put himself through college working at carnivals and amusement parks and became the manager of the carnival's games department. There, Bushnell quickly learned the economics of the coin-operated games business. He also came to understand something about people. They would pay a lot of money to be entertained, even if the entertainment was just blinking lights on a screen. Atari's first commercially successful game was Pong, a simple tennis-like game with two bars as paddles and a bouncing ball. Now, Pong wasn't exactly original. Similar games were being developed. One of the early versions was by Magnavox Odyssey. But like all great entrepreneurs, when Bushnell saw it, he thought, I can do this better. And he did. Where the Odyssey's tennis game was silent and scored by hand, Bushnell imagined a game that had sound effects and automatic scoring. The guy who built Pong was Alan Alcorn. Alcorn joined Atari in 1972 as one of the company's first engineers. Pong was his first assignment, and it was given to him as a practice project. Bushnell said to him, "Make me a better version of the Magnavox tennis game." But Alcorn went a lot further. Alcorn's engineering work on Pong was groundbreaking for its time. He created the game using discrete logic circuits. This was before microprocessors were common in games. Alcorn was able to create features like increasing the ball's speed as volleys got longer and adding different ball angles based on which part of the paddle the ball hit. When Bushnell saw Alcorn's work, he was blown away. The first test was to see what people thought. So they took their prototype, which was essentially a wooden box with the circuit boards, controllers, and a TV screen, and they put it next to the jukebox and pinball machines at Andy Cap's Tavern in downtown Sunnydale. A few days later, they got a call from the bar owner saying the machine wasn't working. When they came to fix the machine, they discovered that the game didn't break because of a design flaw, but because the coin mechanism was overflowing with quarters. Knowing they had a hit on their hands, they started manufacturing Pong arcade machines immediately. And by the following year, they'd sold more than 8,000 of them. Working at Atari was special from day one. Bushnell made sure it wasn't just a business. He wanted it to be a living, breathing version of his philosophy that inventing the future should be fun. This was Silicon Valley before Silicon Valley knew what it was going to become. Programmers were treated like rock stars. Engineers were given total creative freedom. Kegs of beer in the office were a constant, and board meetings took place in a hot tub. Bushnell encouraged a culture of experimentation and controlled chaos. He felt that creativity couldn't be managed, it could only be nurtured. The company motto might as well have been, "What amazing thing can we build next?" People were hired not just because they had the right credentials, but because they had the right kind of crazy. And the games that came out of this culture were unlike anything the world had seen. There was Space Race, a game where players control rockets trying to avoid obstacles. And Grand Track 10 was the first racing game that featured a steering wheel, gear shift, and pedals. And there was a combat game called Tank Command that was one of the first games to use ROM chips for graphics. And the famous brick breaking game where players used a paddle to bounce a ball and destroy rows of bricks called Breakout. One of the developers on the Breakout team was a 19-year-old Steve Jobs. It was widely reported that due to his abrasive personality and poor hygiene habits, Jobs was relegated to the night shift to avoid interacting with other employees. But Bushnell put him on the night shift for another very astute reason. He had heard Jobs' best friend Steve Wozniak was quietly helping Jobs with his design work. And knowing that Woz worked during the day at HP, if he put Jobs on the night shift, he knew he would get two designers for the price of one. Bushnell believed to make a company great, you had to make room for all kinds of personalities. That the genius happened when you mixed different people together. And the group he assembled did some amazing things. The early games they designed established many gaming conventions like competitive multiplayer, sports simulations, racing games, and action games, and they would influence the entire industry going forward. Each of these early games were a large arcade-style system, but as computer chips got smaller and less expensive, the natural evolution was the home console business. For Atari, it started almost by accident. The company had been working on an Atari home console for years, but they were having a hard time finding retail distribution. Many retailers rejected the idea because they didn't think people would ever play video games at home. Then, while on a flight, Bushnell just happened to sit next to the head buyer from the global retailer Sears. During their conversation, Bushnell mentioned Atari's home version of Pong. The Sears executive was intrigued and asked if Atari could produce a home console exclusively for Sears. Bushnell said, "Of course." And in 1975, Atari created the very first home version of Pong and sold it exclusively through Sears. They called it Telegames Pong, and Sears ordered 200,000 units for the Christmas season. This was a massive gamble for both companies, but it sold like crazy. And suddenly, Atari wasn't just an arcade company, they were pioneering home entertainment. Because the Pong console sold so well, it proved there was substantial consumer demand for home video games, and the Atari brand took off. But success, especially rapid success, has a way of attracting attention from people who want to convince you that you need help managing it. And Nolan Bushnell, for all his genius as a visionary and culture builder, was not what you'd call a traditional business manager. He was more interested in the next big idea. He loved science fiction and wanted to live there, not in a boardroom. So in 1976, when Warner Communications came calling with an offer of $28 million and the pitch that they were the company Bushnell needed to help scale Atari into a global brand, Bushnell said yes. In the beginning, it seemed like a good partnership. Warner was looking to enter the video game market and had the capital needed to help Atari mass produce and release the Atari Video Computer System, later called the Atari 2600. This wasn't just another home Pong console, this was something entirely new. The Atari 2600 introduced a new concept to home gaming. the ability to play different games by inserting different cartridges. It was like having an infinitely expandable entertainment system in your living room. This was a massive evolution in gaming. Before this, if you wanted to play a bunch of different games, you had to go to a video game arcade with a bag of quarters. Now, all of those games from the arcade were on cartridges the size of a deck of playing cards. In its first year, Atari sold close to 400,000 units, completely selling out their initial production run. And it wasn't long before Atari was worth $2 billion and controlled 80% of the video game market. The console hardware was a brilliant piece of technology, but it didn't take long for the company to realize that Atari's future relied on people buying the games, and a lot of them. Luckily for Atari, Bushnell had staffed the company with the rock stars of game designers, and they didn't disappoint. The home version of Space Invaders took off and generated over $100 million in revenue. But while the sale of Atari made Bushnell a rich man, he was quickly losing control of his company. There were growing tensions and disagreements with Warner over the company's culture, marketing, and how long it should take to make hit games. It was around this time that Bushnell had a marketing idea to introduce Atari to a younger group. He noticed that there was no fun place for families and kids to play games. His idea was a family-friendly place that housed dozens of Atari games and served pizza. He called it Chuck E. Cheese. But Warner hated it, so he bought it from Atari and spun off the idea himself. Even though Atari was worth billions and dominated the video game market, Warner management believed Bushnell was holding Atari back. They believed scaling Atari into a massive consumer electronics company would take professional management and someone who understood how to run a big business. So Warner installed Ray Kassar as the new CEO. On Kassar's first day at Atari, he arrived in a three-piece suit. It was like a Victorian schoolmaster taking control of a hippie commune. During one of the early management meetings, Kassar was offered a joint. He looked at the group with disdain, left the room, and immediately started restructuring the company. Tensions between Bushnell and Kassar quickly reached a head, and Bushnell left his company. The hot tub, where many of the board meetings took place, was drained. Keg taps shut off, and schedules of meetings were established. But besides cultural, the real change that Warner and Kassar brought was philosophical. While Bushnell saw game designers as artists and rock stars, Kassar saw them as mere factory workers. This could have been because prior to Atari, Ray Kassar had spent 26 years in the towel business, where innovation meant finding a slightly softer cotton blend. But it wasn't just cultural and philosophical changes Warner and Kassar created that led to Atari's unraveling. I believe it was the fear they brought along with those changes that fueled the company's collapse. Here's the thing about fear in corporate America. The fear that cuts the path to a company's failure is almost never what you think it is. It's rarely fear of failure. Most executives have already failed plenty and live to talk about it. The fear that destroys companies is much more cunning. And the changes to Atari's culture triggered a kind of ecosystem of corporate anxieties that fed off each other, each one making the other stronger. The first was the fear of losing control. It's the kind of fear that will turn the best CEOs into micromanagers and tyrants. At Atari, this manifested as an obsession with refusing to credit developers and programmers, treating them like replaceable cogs in a machine. And the absurd thing about this point of view on talent was Atari had attracted developers and programmers who were doing things no other company in the world was doing. Take Warren Robinett, who created the game Adventure. This was the first action-adventure game ever made, and he did it with just 4 kilobytes of memory. To put that in perspective, this sentence I'm saying contains more data than he had to work with. Today's modern game developers like to have 16 gigs of RAM, and 4 kilobytes is 0.3% of 16 gigs. Robinett was so frustrated by the refusal to credit developers that he hid his name in the game, creating the world's first Easter egg. To see it, Players of the game had to find a small dot and carry it to a secret room. When they did, created by Warren Robinette flashed on the screen. Robinette's Easter egg used 5% of the game's entire memory just so he could get credit for his work. And then there was Bob Whitehead. Now here's a guy who'd figured out how to make the Atari 2600 do things it wasn't supposed to be able to do. He invented something called the Venetian blinds technique that tricked the system into displaying more sprites than it could handle. A sprite is a movable graphic object or character that can move around the screen while the background is static. In Super Mario Bros., Mario, the coins, and the power-ups were all sprites. Pac-Man himself, the 4 ghosts, the dots, and the power pellets were sprites. The term sprite came from computer graphics developers who thought the objects they were coding seemed to dance around the screen like mythical sprites or fairies. Sprites were one of the fundamental building blocks that made early arcade games possible. And even the leading home consoles, like the Atari 2600, could only display 2 sprites at once. 2. That's it. If you wanted to shoot lasers at space invaders, play a chess game, or show multiple football players on a field, you were basically handcuffed by the hardware. Whitehead looked at this limitation and didn't accept it. And his Venetian blinds technique was pure programming artistry. Named for the visual effect it created, the rapidly repositioned sprites would create horizontal bands across the screen that resembled the slats of Venetian blinds. This allowed him to rapidly reposition and redraw sprites multiple times during each frame, creating the illusion that there were many more objects on screen than the system could actually handle. It was a magic trick performed in assembly code, and it was crucial for early gaming because it allowed smooth animation without the processing power. But Robinette and Whitehouse weren't the only ones. There was David Crane, who created the Western-themed shooter game called Outlaw, and Larry Kaplan, who built Air-Sea Battle, and Alan Miller, who designed the action game called Surround. Then one day, these guys learned something that would change everything. A financial memo circulated at Atari ranking the success of the current games. From the spreadsheet, it was easy to see that the most successful were designed by just 4 developers. The memo ended with this sentence: Crane, Kaplan, Miller, and Whitehead's games are responsible for 60% of Atari's cartridge sales. 4 people, using techniques they invented themselves, working with hardware limitations that would make modern programmers weep, had created 60% of the value of a billion-dollar company. Their annual salary was $20,000. These guys weren't just mere employees, they were Atari. The next day, these 4 programmers walked into the CEO's office and approached Kassar with a simple request. They wanted what any creative person would want: their names on the boxes and maybe, just maybe, a small royalty. But the idea that these 4 had revolutionized an entire medium through pure creativity was completely outside Kassar's experience. And he then proved it was outside his ability to comprehend. After the programmer's pitch, Kassar leaned back in his chair and delivered what might be the most expensive sentence in the history of tech when he said, "You 4 are no more important to those games than the guy on the assembly line who puts them together." Within that sentence lies the beginning of the end of Atari. The next day, those 4 programmers walked out of Atari and started Activision, creating the very first third-party game developer. Within a year, Activision had $60 million in revenue, and 2 years later, it rose to $150 million. Their game Pitfall was one of their biggest hits, selling over 4 million copies. Meanwhile, over those same 2 years, Atari's share of the cartridge market fell from 75% to less than 40%. The fear of losing control had created exactly what it sought to prevent. It created competition that became powered by the innovations that had made Atari successful in the first place. Oh, and by the way, Activision was recently acquired by Microsoft for $69 billion, the biggest gaming industry deal in history. Once other companies saw that Activision could succeed, everyone wanted in. By 1982, the number of games available for the Atari 2600 had exploded from about 100 to over 400. By 1983, over 200 companies were making games for Atari's console. But instead of bringing in the next generation of developers to innovate and design the next cool games, Atari put their energy into suing Activision for $20 million. Then they took out full-page ads that essentially called their former employees criminals. And when that didn't work, they tried to strong-arm retailers into not carrying third-party games. Atari had developed a deep fear of their competition, and it led to a fatal strategic error. Instead of focusing on quality to distinguish themselves from the flood of new competitors, Atari doubled down on quantity. Their strategy was to try and dominate through sheer volume. They used their dominance of the market to pressure distributors into placing all their orders at once, so a majority of the store's budget was spent on Atari. But that backfired because the quality of gameplay was slipping, and when games didn't sell as expected, massive quantities were returned. The most infamous example was Pac-Man. Despite there only being 10 million Atari consoles in homes, Atari decided to manufacture 12 million Pac-Man cartridges. They believed people would be so excited for an at-home version of Pac-Man, they would buy the entire console just to play it. But Atari rushed the development and gameplay barely resembled the original arcade version. Graphics flickered, mazes were missing, and sometimes Pac-Man would die without touching a ghost. Despite the horrendous word of mouth, they did manage to sell 7 million copies of the game. But they were still left with 5 million unsold cartridges. And all the press wrote about were the massive number of returns and the mountain of unsold games. The Atari brand took a big hit. Once a platform known for making the very best video games in the world, Atari games were now consistently getting one-star reviews. And while Atari was obsessing over quantity, its competitors were all about quality. Activision's games like Laser Blast, Freeway, and Kaboom were considered by fans as some of the best gameplay on the Atari 2600 console. And Pitfall became one of the best-selling games that pushed Atari's hardware further than Atari thought possible. But this wasn't surprising since the people building the Activision games knew exactly how to get the most out of Atari, since they helped design the console. Activision was committed to polished gameplay, thoroughly testing and refining rather than rushing their games to market. And they credited their programmers, often putting their pictures on the game boxes. This attracted the best talent to want to work at Activision, and fans began buying games based on who designed it, knowing the gameplay would be stellar. Next, Atari leadership joined the pantheon of leaders who asked the insidious question, what if our new product hurts the sales of our old product? Also known as the fear of cannibalization. And this terror that the next big thing would eat into existing revenue streams completely paralyzed Atari's innovation. Personal computers were starting to look like the future, and Atari was perfectly positioned to dominate that market. Their computer engineers had designed and built prototypes for a computer line called the Atari 400 and the Atari 800, and it was technologically superior to most competitors. But when Kassar and Atari's management saw it, they grew worried, asking, what if people buy our home computers instead of our video game consoles? This may sound reasonable until you think about it for more than 5 seconds. You see, the Atari 2600 was selling for around $150, and competition was driving the price down. And the Atari computers were set to retail for $800 to $1,200. Not only was the margin much higher on their line of computers, but they weren't even in competing markets. They were complementary ones. But fear doesn't traffic in logic. So while Commodore was pushing the Commodore 64, and while Apple was building the Apple II ecosystem, and while IBM was defining home and business computing, Atari let their computer division wither. And as the home computer market began to boom, the video game market was crashing. The Commodore 64 became one of the best-selling computers in history. Meanwhile, Atari focused on protecting a dying business of the home video game console. Next came Atari's worry that they were losing their identity as a maker of hit games, and the belief that one big hit could save it. Ironically, this led Atari to rush their new games to market with exactly the kind of inferior design that created these worries in the first place. And nothing captures this paradox better than the ET debacle. In the summer of 1982, Warner Communications CEO Steve Ross was desperate for a hit game. After the Pac-Man disaster, he wanted to prove to the world that the Atari brand still stood for great games. So he scheduled a meeting with Steven Spielberg and promised him that Atari could create a hit game based on his new blockbuster film, E.T. The price tag for the rights was reportedly a staggering $25 million. It wasn't just a ridiculous price, it was a ridiculous promise, especially since Atari had never made an action game out of a movie. To make matters worse, they gave programmer Howard Scott Warshaw just 5 weeks to develop the game. 5 weeks for what should have been a 6-month project. But Ross had promised Spielberg, so Atari was committed to spending a fortune on a game that everyone thought was a terrible idea. Learning absolutely nothing from the Pac-Man overproduction disaster, they committed to manufacturing 5 million cartridges. They were so convinced that the combination of the Atari and Spielberg names alone would sell millions of games. But they forgot that the reason people buy video games is for the gameplay, and E.T. was unplayable. Out of 5 million produced, they sold 1.5 million cartridges. Many who got E.T. for Christmas didn't just return the game. They started questioning whether Atari games were worth buying at all. By early 1983, Atari was becoming synonymous with disappointment. Unable to unload the remaining 3.5 million ET cartridges, Atari loaded them into 14 trucks, drove them into the desert of New Mexico, and buried their mistake. In 2014, a documentary crew excavated the New Mexico landfill and recovered hundreds of the ET game cartridges. They collectively sold at auction for over $100,000. Atari's E.T., the game that symbolized catastrophic decision-making, would eventually become valuable not for its gameplay, but for its role in one of business history's greatest failures. Atari's fear of losing control, mixed with their fear of competition and their fear of cannibalization, as well as their fear of losing their brand's identity, reached its inevitable conclusion. Warner Communications announced that Atari's earnings had fallen instead of a projected double-digit increase. This surprise caused Warner's stock price to fall by a third overnight. But just 23 minutes before the earnings announcement, Ray Kassar sold thousands of his shares of Warner stock, leading to an investigation by the SEC for insider trading. The man who had been so terrified of losing control had lost control of his own greed. By 1983, Atari's net loss was $536 million. Their market share fell below 20%, and they were forced to reduce their headcount by 80%. These cascading events triggered an industry-wide video game market crash, and global revenue of all video game companies dropped from $3.2 billion to just $100 million, a 97% decline. The Japanese called it Atari shock. Steve Ross had had enough and fired Kassar. Ray Kassar, the man who referred to the programmers and creators of the modern video game industry as no more important to the game than the guy on the assembly line, who fired or forced out nearly every single one of the original Atari employees, and whose obsession to control artists spawned Activision, left Atari a shell of its former self. But Ray was eventually immortalized. In an Activision game called Yar's Revenge, game designers that Kassar had dismissed jokingly created the name Yar by spelling Ray backwards. The game became one of the company's best sellers. In July of 1984, Warner Communications was done and sold Atari's consumer division to Jack Tramiel, not for cash, but for $240 million in promissory notes. Atari was hemorrhaging money, and Warner was so eager to stop Atari's massive losses from destroying their entire company that taking an IOU was better than keeping Atari. The company that had created the video game industry was essentially given away. Atari is still in business today, but they have become a nostalgia brand, primarily focusing on reviving and modernizing vintage properties like Asteroids, Centipede, and Missile Command. Their revenue last year was $22 million. That's about 1% of their peak revenue of $2 billion in 1982. From the Atari Shock video game crash rose a vibrant and healthy gaming industry. Nintendo learned from Atari's mistakes and took a different approach, building superior hardware and put strict quality controls on game development. They limited third-party developers to 5 games per year and required approval for every title. This helped create the official Nintendo seal of quality. They also created a profit-sharing agreement with developers that kept their top talent happy and made many of them very rich. By 1987, Nintendo controlled 90% of the American video game market, and they are still going strong. In the summer of 2025, hundreds of Nintendo fans slept outside of stores waiting to get their hands on the Nintendo Switch. Atari could have been Nintendo. They could have been Apple. They could have been Microsoft, who started Xbox and bought Activision. They had every advantage: technology, talent, market position, and capital. But the one thing they lacked was the courage to trust the people who made Atari special. At the age of 82, Nolan Bushnell is still very active in the gaming industry, building a gamified learning and education platform with the goal of using games to help teach kids faster with higher retention. He believes that if you can fix education, you can fix the world. Recently, he had this to say about Atari. Very seldom does a market leader abandon its marketplace the way Atari did. When they did, its dominance fell to Nintendo. Instead of America dominating the video game business forever, they lost it. And this from Kassar. What I did was turn Atari into a business. When I got there, it was kind of a playground, a bunch of engineers who just loved to play games. They weren't about the business. Personally, I think the biggest thing we can all learn from the Atari story is to cherish and protect those that make our companies unique and special, especially when the company is small. I have seen it many times. As a company grows and there is pressure to become a more serious organization, these artists of your culture are dismissed. If they are left unprotected, they begin to be seen as misfits, then oddballs, and then troublemakers. But these perceived misfits and oddballs are usually the souls that make your company special. The smart leaders see them as their secret weapons, and the genius CEOs pull them to the center and let them cook. Thank you for joining me for this episode of A Case Study in Corporate Fear. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and leave us a review. I'd also love to hear your thoughts on how fear might be affecting your organization, as well as what company you would like to see covered next. For more case studies and to further understand the impact fear can have on your company, visit fear-incorporated.com. You will also find the sources and citations used to fact-check this episode.